Hi Year 13, this revision session is on the impact of the 1867 Reform Act. If you haven't watched the video yet on the reasons for the passing of the Reform Act, I suggest you go back and watch that first. So we're going to look at the impact of the Reform Act in four different sort of sections. We're going to start by looking at the franchise, then we'll look at redistribution of seats, then the power of the aristocracy, and finally party organisation. And then we're also going to think a little bit about how the 1867 Reform Act led to further legislation. So if we start with franchise, the 1867 Reform Act led to changes in both the borough and the county franchise, although the changes to the borough was much more significant. The reason for the more significant changes to the borough franchise is because the Conservatives by 1867 found it far easier to win in the counties than in the boroughs. Therefore, they had an incentive to leave the county franchise relatively unchanged because they believed that they would continue to win seats there. However, they were already losing quite significantly in the borough elections, and therefore changing the boroughs significantly, it was like they didn't have anything to lose sort of situation. The idea was that they could potentially add Conservative voters by giving working men in the boroughs the vote. But if they didn't, it wouldn't be the end of the world because they still had the county elections to rely on. So what were the changes in the boroughs then? So in the boroughs, if you were a male owner or tenant of a house, i.e. a male householder, and you'd been resident for 1 year, you could have the vote. Now, this was important because it meant that if you were someone who lived in a lodging house with multiple occupiers, particularly if that lodging house had like the owner living in the lodging house and then there were other people who'd come to live in it, if you were a man or a woman in that situation, then you wouldn't have the vote. Also, if you were an adult living with parents or living in a house in which another family lived, you would probably not be seen as a householder. Also, if you were a servant, so if you were living in a house that belonged to other people and working for them, then again, you wouldn't be seen as a householder. So that kind of requirement to be the householder meant that a number of people couldn't vote. Also, that resident for 1 year, that was designed to make sure that some of the kind of less skilled working class people that tended to move around quite regularly, that those people wouldn't be able to gain the vote either. It wasn't only householders that had the vote, though. There were some exceptions. So, for example, if you were a lodger but you paid £10 a year, then you could have the vote. That kind of person would probably be someone who was from the middle class, but who was a single man and so was living in a lodging house, but a very high quality lodging house, because that's quite expensive rent that they'd be paying. Now, even though there were still quite a few people that didn't have the vote in the counties, in the boroughs, the electorate increased significantly. So, for example, in Leeds, the electorate increased by 4, so it quadrupled the size of the Leeds electorate because there were so many male householders that had been excluded from the vote before 1867 and then now had been added into the franchise. So that increase was very significant. If we kind of look at the proportion of people who could vote after the 1867 Reform Act, it was about 1/3 of the population, of the male population, could have the vote. After 1884, that went up to 2/3. That's when the working class of the countryside got the vote. So if we kind of think about working class in the cities, after the 1867 Reform Act, about half of the urban working class were given the vote. So 1/3 of the whole adult population, about half of the adult working class population in the cities. So the changes in the counties were less significant, but there were still some changes. So the size of the county electorate increased by about 50%, whereas in the boroughs it often more than doubled, as you can see with the Leeds electorate. That increased because the amount of the amount of land that you had to own reduced, so it went down from 40 shillings to £5. And if you were a tenant, it went down from £50 tenants to £12 tenants. So you would still have to be a pretty rich tenant farmer to get the vote. This wasn't going to enfranchise like small holding people with small holdings of land. But it was still a fairly significant increase, so a 50% increase in the counties. That kind of corresponds with the 1832 Reform Act, because after 1832, the franchise increased by about 60%. So it wasn't completely insignificant, the changes to the counties. But the idea was still designed to protect the Conservative Party. So the people who were given the vote were still going to be relatively wealthy farmers. And the idea was that these people would vote according to the kind of wishes of the local aristocrat. They would vote deferentially. So this was a pretty significant increase, and that kind of explains why people like Stanley, who was the leader of the Conservative Party in 1867, he was in the House of Lords because he was the Earl of Derby. He calls this act a leap in the dark because there was definitely a recognition that this was a highly radical act. And as time went on, the borough franchise actually continued to increase. So from 1867 to 1884, the number of people in the voters continued to go up. That was for a number of reasons. But one of them was that it was very difficult to, if someone went to go and register to vote, it was very difficult to prove that they didn't meet some of these requirements. So say you hadn't been resident for a year, but you did want to try and get the vote, you could go along and just say, I have been resident for a year. It was difficult to prove that you hadn't been. And so for that reason, a commentator from London in 1882 said that the qualification to vote is within the reach of every man who cares to have it. So there was this kind of recognition that particularly in the boroughs, unless you were very clearly disqualified from the franchise, so say if you were a servant, clearly you couldn't vote. If you lived with your parents, clearly you couldn't vote. But if it was that resident for 1 year thing that was preventing you from voting, you probably could go and get on the electoral register anyway. So a very radical increase in the franchise. So we're going to look at distribution now. When we look at the distribution or redistribution of seats following the 1867 Reform Act, we can see clearly that this was a Conservative act rather than a Liberal act. And it was, when it came to distribution, that really helped Disraeli to persuade his party to stay with him and vote for the Reform Act in 1867, although a lot of his party would have instinctively wanted to avoid reform, because Disraeli was able to say to them that a Reform Act is inevitable. That was shown by the 1866 protests at Hyde Park, which made it very clear that avoiding reform would lead to unrest, and that wanted to be avoided. So Disraeli could say reform is inevitable. If the Conservatives don't pass a Reform Act, the Liberals will, and a Liberal Reform Act is going to be advantageous to the Liberals, not our party. And it was in redistribution which Disraeli did a lot to try and ensure that the Conservative Party would not be put at a disadvantage following the Reform Act. And so there were a number of measures that tried to kind of make the Reform Act less disruptive to the status quo. One example of this is that 54 boroughs with fewer than 10,000 voters continued to exist following the 1867 Reform Act. So although these weren't we shouldn't really see them as pocket boroughs in the same way, and they certainly weren't rotten boroughs, 10,000 voters was considerably more than the rotten boroughs of before 1832. These small boroughs were much easier for the local aristocracy to influence. And we know this benefited the Conservatives because in the years between 1867 and 1885, when further redistribution happened, in those sort of nearly 20 years, the Conservatives were far more likely to win in those smaller boroughs. And that was for a combination of reasons, but it was generally because a member of the aristocracy had a strong influence in those boroughs, and that bribery was used to make sure that the voters in those boroughs voted according with that kind of aristocratic, with the wishes of that member of aristocracy. So that was one way in which the status quo was protected. Another thing that the Conservatives made sure continued to exist was the kind of the disparity between representation in the north and representation in the south. So if you looked at the sort of southwest region of the country, there were 45 MPs in the southwest, and compare that to the northeast, The northeast had a population that was 3 times larger than the southwest, and yet they only had 32 MPs. So this was a careful way of making sure that the landed influence continued to have a disproportionate influence, because agricultural areas like the southwest had more representation than industrial areas like the northeast. So that helped protect the status quo for the Conservative Party. Another way in which they did that is that when some of the smaller boroughs were disenfranchised, those seats were redistributed so that there were 25 extra county seats. This had been done after the 1832 Reform Act as well, when more county seats had been added. And this was a way of making sure that the number of people in the House of Commons that represented the agricultural or the landowning influence remained as high, or well, actually it remained higher than the number of MPs representing the industrial influence, or the industrial interest, sorry. So there were a high number of county seats. We also know that by 1867, the Conservatives tended to win in the counties, so that was beneficial for them as well. Another way of making sure that the Conservatives continued to have an influence in the counties and continued to win those seats more easily was that the borough constituencies were made larger. Now that might sound a bit strange. You might think, well, how would that help the Conservatives? But if you imagine Leeds as a constituency, there were areas around Leeds that were close by to the city, but were actually in the Yorkshire County constituency rather than in Leeds. So if you think of somewhere on the outskirts of Leeds, places like Yeadon might be a good example, or Scholes. So those are relatively small urban centres on the outside of Leeds. And a lot of people living in Yeadon or Scholes in 1867, even though they were in the county constituency, actually would have been quite urban minded because they were very close to Leeds. So they might buy Leeds newspapers, they might go to social activities in Leeds, they might even work in Leeds and walk into work. So those urban minded county voters were then, the constituency was redrawn so that those kind of voters would be drawn into the borough voting instead. So someone who would previously have been in the Yorkshire County but voted in a kind of urban way, if that made sense, they were now in the borough county. So that meant that the Conservatives could continue to win in the counties because those people that lived on the edge of the city weren't voting in the county elections, they were voting in the borough elections. I hope that makes sense. But if it doesn't, there is a section in the book that you could go to on it, which is, there's a whole section on redistribution. But hopefully that made sense the way I explained it. So there were a number of things that the Conservatives had done to make sure that the status quo was protected when it came to distribution. But they couldn't completely avoid change, and there were definitely some important changes that were made. So many small boroughs were disenfranchised, although those 54 small boroughs were left behind. Most small boroughs were disenfranchised in 1867, and larger boroughs, places like Leeds, Manchester, London, gained extra MPs. So Leeds got one more, London got quite a few more. I don't know exactly, but they got quite a few more MPs. Interestingly, what starts to happen after 1867 is that London boroughs, the boroughs within London, were more likely to vote Conservative, whereas places like Leeds and Manchester, which were continued to be less represented in the House of Commons, they actually tended to continue to vote Liberal. That's just an interesting change that started to happen. So as you can see, the 1867 Reform Act, when it came to distribution, the distribution definitely favoured the Conservative Party by protecting Conservative influence in the counties. However, there were some important changes, larger boroughs getting extra MPs, for example. So we're going to look at changes to the power of the aristocracy following 1867 now. So you might be thinking, why are we not looking at the changes to the power of the Crown in 1867? The reason for that is because the the reduction in the power of the monarchy had largely been established by 1840. It was in 1860 that Walter Bagehot, the kind of political commentator, famously wrote down his views on the role of the monarch in the English constitution. And so he said that the monarch had the right to be consulted, the right to encourage, and the right to warn. He wrote that in 1860, and that pretty much continued to exist through to the 20th century. So the power of the monarch did not change very much at all in 1867, because it had already been changed so significantly by 1832. But the power of the aristocracy changed considerably. Rather than this being an immediate change in 1867, what I would say is that the 1867 Reform Act sort of sowed the seeds for the end of aristocratic influence over elections. That doesn't mean the end of aristocratic influence over government, because following 1867, members of the aristocracy continued to be prominent in the government. Aristocratic members continued to be more likely to be the Prime Minister. There was high numbers of members of the aristocracy in the cabinet. So it's not that the power of the aristocracy after 1867 went away completely, but the power of the aristocracy over elections declined significantly. So we're going to look at how the power of the aristocracy changed in boroughs and counties separately. So if we look at the counties first of all, the power of the aristocracy in the counties did not change significantly as a result of the 1867 Reform Act. Most counties continued to return Conservative members. Most voters in counties continued to practice deferential voting, so automatically voting for the candidate favoured by the local aristocracy. That became less likely after 1872, which I'll look at in a second, but it did, deferential voting continued to have an influence in the counties for a long, long time. And also the aristocracy, because the county electorate remained much smaller than the borough electorate, the aristocracy could continue to use, corruption and bribery to make sure that their preferred candidate would be returned. So a good example of this was in Gloucester in 1880. A commission into the election found that 38% of voters in Gloucester, which was a county seat, had accepted bribes. So in the counties, the aristocracy continued to exercise considerable power over what happened in elections, and that remained the case right up until 1884 and beyond. However, in the boroughs, the power of the aristocracy changed significantly. So obviously there were still 54 small boroughs that remained where the aristocracy could have an influence, but in most boroughs, bribery became far more difficult because of the massive increase in the electorate. So as mentioned earlier, the size of the electorate in Leeds quadrupled. And once the electorate had become that large, it was very difficult to use bribery in order to persuade people to vote one way or another. So the power of the aristocracy over borough elections reduced massively in 1867. That's not to say that the number of people from the landed class reduced too much in the House of Commons, because actually, even though the power of the aristocracy to influence elections decreased massively, the number of middle and working class MPs remained quite low. There was a slight increase in kind of like lawyers and doctors who were becoming MPs, but there was still, after 1867, there was still not many kind of like business owners or things like that were in the House of Commons. And that was mostly because there was still no payment for MPs, so that didn't get introduced until 1911. So the main change that occurred for the power of the aristocracy, the most important change, is that it became very, very difficult for them to influence borough elections. There were still kind of people of the landed interest in the House of Commons. There were still those 54 small boroughs, but in most boroughs, the aristocracy could no longer choose who the winning candidate would be. But so that was a kind of most important, real obvious change, a change that was very evident. But there was also this really important shift that was kind of more of a conceptual shift. So after 1867, it became clear that the influence of the electorate would now be just as important as the influence of the political elite. Whereas after 1832, the importance of a majority in the House of Commons became the most important thing in forming a government. it was still the case that the kind of political elite could manipulate that majority. So if we take, for example, the Liberals, in 1835, a group of members of the political elite, Radical MPs, Whig MPs, and Irish MPs met and kind of formed a sort of forced coalition in order to make sure that Liberals could win a majority. Now, that wasn't really anything to do with the electorate. That was we might call it like a backroom deal these days. So the political elite was using the electorate and making sure that they had a majority by making these deals. But after 1867, the electorate became just as important, if not more important, than the kind of actions of the political elite. And that basically forced politicians to become far more responsive to the electorate and far less responsive to aristocratic wishes or the wishes of the landed class. And the best evidence of that is the fact that in 1872 and then in 1883, 2 laws passed which reduced the power of the aristocracy significantly. Those laws were, of course, the 1872 Ballot Act and the 1883 the Restriction of Illegal and Corrupt Practices Act. So I just wanted to look at that in a little bit more detail, because these 2 acts were definitely caused by the 1867 Reform Act, and they were caused by this kind of understanding that the political elite had to become far more responsive to the electorate if they wanted to continue to win power. So the act, when it enfranchised male householders, it meant that 1 in 3 males could vote. The increased size of the electorate led to the professionalisation of political parties, which I'll talk about in a second. But this kind of recognition that the electorate was more powerful and more important, and that that political parties would have to be more responsible to the electorate, led to these 2 acts. So the 1872 Ballot Act, which introduced the secret ballot, and the 1883 Corrupt and Illegal Practices Act, which set spending limits for each constituency, so bribery could no longer be used in elections. Now, these 2 acts were a really huge blow for aristocratic influence. The Ballot Act sowed the seeds for the reduction of the aristocratic influence, particularly in the counties, because deferential voting became much less important. Some people still did vote deferentially, but there was no requirement to. No one would know whether you had done or not. And also the reduction of corruption meant that aristocratic money couldn't really buy elections anymore. Now, these 2 changes clearly kind of almost entirely removed aristocratic influence over elections. And these were acts that were supported by the House of Commons. So clearly, after 1867, aristocratic influence over the House of Commons had declined massively, because MPs voted for 2 acts that would massively reduce aristocratic influence. And these 2 acts show that the electorate was being prioritised over the aristocracy, which I think is a really important impact of 1867. So the final change that we're going to look at now is party organisation. So if we were going to summarise the changes to party organisation that occurred after 1867, we want to use the word professionalisation. So political parties became far more professional after 1867. That was for a number of reasons. The first and most important of these was the fact that 1 million new voters needed to be registered following 1867. And so both parties needed to make efforts to register people that they believed they could persuade to vote for their party. And because this was something that was happening in the boroughs, it became really important for the party organisations that had been set up before 1867 to try and register those members. Now, as was often the case, the Conservatives responded better to this need. So that was because the Conservatives typically didn't win elections as easily as the Liberals. And so when they were defeated in 1868, despite passing the 1867 Reform Act, which Disraeli had hoped would win the loyalty of new working class voters, they were defeated, and this led to this acceptance that party organisation needed to improve significantly. So a really important figure in that improvement to Conservative Party organisation was John Gorst. He was put in charge of the Conservative Central Office, which was set up following the 1868 defeat. And this Conservative Central Office reflected an importance that both parties came to recognise, that the national party after 1867 was far more important. So whereas in 1832, parties did become more organised and they did become more important, the local issues remained more important in determining elections. So the connection that the MP had with his constituency, for example, the kind of realisation or the understanding that the MP had for local issues was still more important after 1832. But after 1867, the national party image became important. And the Conservatives definitely recognised that, and we can see that in the setting up of this Conservative Central Office. And the Central Office was designed to, or was intended to coordinate the local party associations. These local party associations were called National Unions of Constitutional and Conservative Associations. It's a bit of a mouthful, so you can just call it NUCA if you're writing this in essays. And the Conservative Central Office was very good at encouraging these local associations to set up. We can see that because by 1877 there was 791 local associations. And these different associations would kind of encourage, they would kind of have like local events that would encourage like new voters to come along. They would assist with voter registration. They would assist with organisation at election times. And there were really good ways of kind of bringing the party at Westminster and connecting the party at Westminster with the electorate on a more local level. And a really important thing that the Conservatives did, reflecting that in 1868 they hadn't managed to win the voters, new working class voters over. So they founded Conservative working men's clubs in boroughs. And these were often founded by local people, but they would be supported financially by the Conservative Party. And it was a really good way of getting working class voters into the kind of Conservative fold. So here's a good example of one here. This is Batley Conservative Working Men's Club in Leeds. You can see it's pretty grand. It was only able to be that grand because the Conservative Party had funded it. Inside there would have been like billiards room or like snooker. There would have been places to drink. There would have been local speakers coming to talk about political issues. Obviously, within prioritising like conservatively minded speakers. But there also would have been things like amateur dramatic societies connected with the club. There might have been a football team. So it made the Conservative Party a really important aspect of the local community if a club was built. And it might be that you weren't at all supportive of the Conservative Party, but if a Conservative working men's club opened in your area, it might be that you just go along because it's a good place to enjoy your local community, to like have a sports club or whatever, but you would then be kind of more likely to vote Conservative because you were hearing about Conservative issues. You might be grateful to the Conservative Party for setting up this community hub. So this was a really good way of helping to win over working class voters. The Liberals took a bit longer to catch up, and again, when they did catch up, it was as a result of a defeat in election. So the work that the Conservatives did after 1868 helped them to win a really important victory in 1874. And when they won in 1874, the reason why they won is because they were able to win far more borough constituencies than they ever had done before, because of the work they'd done to persuade working class and middle class people to vote for the Conservatives. So following the Liberal defeat in 1874, there was much more work to do what the Conservatives had done to create a better national image for the party. So the National Liberal Federation was set up. There was also more effort on a local level to try and coordinate Liberal voters and try and get Liberal voters to register and then to turn up on election day. So the most successful person to do this was Joseph Chamberlain, who was a radical MP, part of the Liberal Party, and he was an MP in Birmingham. And he had these big long lists of all people that he had registered to vote that he thought would vote Liberal. And on election day, or the lead up to election day, they would go and visit every single one of those voters to try and encourage them to vote. And a lot of people thought this was a bit ridiculous and a bit American. So they would call Joseph Chamberlain's lists the caucus, which they obviously thought was quite funny at the time. I don't think it's necessarily makes sense to us, but that was what it was called. And it was really, really successful, and it helped the Birmingham Liberal MPs to win really impressive victories in the 1880 election. And so that, I think, Joseph Chamberlain's work shows just how professionalised political parties were beginning to come. And although working men's clubs weren't set up by the Liberals straight away, the success of the Conservatives in 1874 encouraged Liberal working men's clubs to be set up as well. And the oldest operating working men's club that exists today is in South Leeds. It's actually right by the football stadiums, right by Elland Road. And that was a Liberal working men's club that was set up there. And that's it's the oldest running one that's still operating as a working men's club today. So the Liberals did start to set them up, but they just took a little bit longer to do so. So both parties improved their organisation. And where I would say the difference was after 1867, so after 1832, organisation on a local level did improve, but it was after 1867 where nationally coordinated organisation improved significantly. And that reflects this recognition that the National Party image had grown significantly and that people were now more likely to vote for a party rather than for a specific MP. And so this recognition that the party and the National Party was more and more important led to a number of different changes. So one of those changes is the fact that the kind of rivalry between Disraeli and Gladstone became very, very important. And this was encouraged by both political parties because it was seen as a way of making politics more exciting. So the rivalry between Disraeli and Gladstone, which definitely did exist, was exaggerated by both parties to try and get people feeling more passionate about their preferred party. So one way of doing this was through the establishment of the Primrose League in 1883. A primrose was Disraeli's favourite flower, and the Primrose League was meant to be kind of encouraging normal people to get involved in Conservative Party organising. So there would members of the Primrose League would go around on election day encouraging people to vote. They would hold fundraisers and tea parties and things like that to encourage people to vote Conservative. It was actually most popular with women, and the idea was that women in the Primrose League would then persuade their husbands to vote Conservative. In contrast, what the Liberal Party did was they had like a lot of merchandise that featured Gladstone, and this was meant to really encourage loyalty to Gladstone and to the Liberal Party. And so, for example, there were things like this, which is a lovely Gladstone teapot. So stuff like that was made around the 1880 election. And this was part of Gladstone's Midlothian campaign. And during the Midlothian campaign of the 1880 election, Gladstone would travel all over the country, making speeches in lots of different places. That was relatively unusual because previously, like if we look at after 1832, Peel, who would always make his speeches in Tamworth, which was where his constituency was, even though he was the National Party leader. But it wasn't very normal for the National Party leader to travel all over the country. But Gladstone started to do that in 1880. He gets this famous Midlothian campaign victory, and things like the teapot reflect a recognition that people needed to buy into the kind of brand of a political party. And that political party was what would win people's loyalty in the years to come. So there was a concerted effort by both parties to win over that kind of long-lasting loyalty. And the fact that political parties have become so important to victory in elections, so the increasing importance of that national party image, that also improved party discipline. So what I mean by that is MPs voting according to what the leader of the political party wanted them to do. So it meant that Gladstone, as a leader of the party, had more power to get his MPs to, for example, vote for issues about Ireland, they might not necessarily have supported Gladstone on that, but they were more likely to vote with Gladstone because they knew that Gladstone was important in them keeping their seat and in them winning elections. So party discipline improved, which again suggests increased professionalisation. And a kind of final thing to say about this is that the political parties were becoming even more important, partly because after 1867, the increased number of voters meant that it was quite rare that a seat was uncontested. So whereas before 1867, about half of seats would be uncontested in each election, so that means in each election, only 1 and 2 of the seats would have like a competition. In all the others, there was just one candidate, and that candidate would obviously be automatically elected. But after 1867, like contesting seats became more and more common, and by 1880, that's the wrong one. By 1880, around 1 in 6 seats were uncontested. So that was about 100 seats being uncontested out of 650. So basically, elections became more like competitive and more important, and it was more likely that a sitting MP would be unseated because they were more likely to be contested in elections. So all of these things combined together to make political parties more important. And all of these changes together effectively meant that political parties had to become much more responsive to the population. And just to come back to that really important change with these acts that were passed to reduce, to make elections more fair, basically. This again happened because political parties had to become more responsive to the electorate, and rather than kind of political parties doing what their supporting aristocracy wanted, they were trying to respond to the electorate. Gladstone became obsessed with being seen as a man of the people, and that was because there was a recognition that the people had become far more important and that parties needed to respond to them. So hopefully that means that kind of brings you up to date with the impact of the 1867 Reform Act, and that you've got notes on those 4 different changes. So changes to franchise, distribution, power of the aristocracy, and party organisation. Make sure in your notes as well that you put down about how the Reform Act led to the 1872 Ballot Act and the Corrupt and Illegal Practices Act as well. So thank you. I hope that was helpful. Sorry, I keep making really long videos. I will try and get better, but I'm not very good. So hopefully that helped. And obviously any questions, as always, email me, hgilbert@roundayschool.com.